I'm a cemetery operations coordinator, or you can just call me a cemetery manager. Part of my job is meeting with guests and family members of the deceased to arrange funerals and sell plots. One day, a man named Antonio, a very spiritual person, came to buy a plot for his sick father who was in hospice care. Antonio was Hispanic with a thick accent, and I could see in his eyes that he was a very caring man. He showed me pictures of his father, who also looked like a very kind man, much too young to be taken away from his family. Unfortunately, his father's time came that same week, and Antonio arranged for the funeral service at the cemetery. The day of the funeral was very stormy, which is thought to be a sign of good luck. The funeral procession stopped briefly in front of the office building. I stepped outside under the front awning and saw Antonio in the car behind the hearse. We waved at each other. Due to the weather, I went back inside until the procession was ready to proceed to the burial site. I got in one of the cemetery pickup trucks and followed the procession to the final stop. My job was to stand with my umbrella and supervise to ensure the funeral services went smoothly. After the funeral, I drove around the cemetery, as I did a couple of times a day, to survey the area. I had a lot of paperwork to take care of, and I had to close the cemetery that night. A little later, I went back to my desk and worked on the paperwork. The cemetery closes at 5:30, so as soon as it started to get dark, I drove around one more time to make sure all visitors had left, then drove over to the front gate to close it. It was a relatively warm early March. The days were still short, so by closing time, it already felt like night, especially on this stormy day. As I was driving back to my office, I thought I saw someone walking quickly down one of the lanes of tombstones before turning behind a hedge and disappearing. I beeped my horn to let them know the place was closed, but I didn't see them again. I grabbed my umbrella and ran out into the rain in that direction. I turned beyond the hedge and looked down a long row of tombstones on one side and hedges on the other. I didn't see anyone. I looked around in the rain for a solid 20 minutes, but eventually had to give up. I drove back to the office and checked the CCTV footage. None of it showed any unusual movement, though it was hard to see much because of the storm and darkness. I tried to multitask, keeping an eye on the camera while finishing up my paperwork, when I heard the front door to the visitation room slam shut. I sprang up from my chair and yelled, "Hello?" I thought maybe it was the same person I saw before, possibly locked in the cemetery and looking for help to leave. I stepped into the lobby, but no one was there. I looked around and said, "Hello?" again. Maybe the door slamming shut was them leaving. I started looking out all the windows, and when I did, I saw someone on the other side looking back at me with a blank expression. I jumped back and screamed, but they didn't flinch. I stepped closer and squinted, realizing I recognized the man. He looked exactly like Antonio's father from the pictures. With my heart in my throat, I ran out the front door to the side, where I saw the man, but he was gone. He wasn't running into the fields or hiding in a bush. He was just gone. I looked around as I stood in the rain getting soaked, then ran back inside, packed up my things, locked up, and got in my car. I opened and closed the gate once more, locking it behind me, and drove home. When my wife asked why I was so quiet, I just told her I had a long day at work. To this day, I think I was just overworking myself and my mind was playing tricks on me, but it still is genuinely disturbing to think about. My name is Alex. This happened one chilly and windy night in October. I live in a somewhat big town with old buildings from the early 18th century. One night, a friend and I were bored and decided to go out at 3 a.m. I know that going out at 3 a.m. in a poor town isn't exactly smart, but we like to have our fun. After driving around and blasting our music, we're both big metalheads and had our own band at that time. We decided it would be interesting to walk around a cemetery in the town. Behind the old market square, there's a massive cemetery divided by a highway, with each side taking up about 20 acres of land. We decided to check out the older part of the cemetery. This part is separated from the newer section by an old iron fence and gate. We started walking around, trying to read the old moss-covered graves and taking pictures. I know it was a bit disrespectful, but these graves were from at least a century ago, so there was no one living who would be upset by it, and I'm sure the people in the graves didn't mind too much. After about an hour of exploring, we sat down next to a giant oak tree in the middle of the old cemetery. That's when we heard a little girl laughing. It sounded really close to us. At first, I thought it might be a toy left on a child's grave or something. I'm not one to scare easily, so I figured it was motion activated or something like that. We both laughed, pointing out how creepy it was, and kept talking and enjoying the ambience. Then, as in all stories like this, I got the feeling that someone was watching me. I figured it was just my imagination, but then my friend said he thought he saw someone in the shadows of a small wooded area right next to the cemetery. We were really close to it at that point, so we both got a little creeped out and decided to leave. Then we heard the same laughing noise again and the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. That's when we ran. We raced down the hill leading to the old part of the cemetery where my car was parked. I've never run that fast in my life. It sounded like the laughing noise was following us. We went into full flight mode, running as fast as we could without thinking. The noises behind us stopped as we reached my car. I started it and drove off, pulling onto the highway without looking. Luckily, no one hit us. We drove to the only gas station open at that time of night to check the back of my car. We were both scared something might have happened to it. When we checked, we found the back doors open. I know for a fact neither of us had opened them. There was no reason for us to. I checked the back seats to make sure nothing was there, then got back in the car and drove off quickly. I'm still confused about what happened that night. I'm not sure if we overreacted or what. All I know is that I still get that weird feeling like something is behind me whenever I tell this story. When I was 19, my friend Chris, who was a big goofball, came over to hang out in our basement like he often did during the summer. I remember he had a Coke bottle in his hand, and I was eating Wendy's when he suggested we check out that creepy little cemetery across town. It was the most random idea ever, and I even told him that, but we had no school the next day, and I knew exactly which cemetery he was talking about. I don't know if you could even call it a regular cemetery. It's just a small plot of land with maybe 100 tombstones at most. The tombstones were very old looking, and any time we'd pass by, it looked like no one had visited in years. The place probably dated back centuries and had a super creepy vibe because it was surrounded by a Gothic metal fence and woods on two sides. The road was on one side, and an old abandoned building was on the other. Everything about it just felt spooky. Chris convinced me to check it out with him. Ironically, it was a very cloudy, reddish kind of day, which added to the mood. Chris pulled up his Honda to the side of the road. I told him to pull up more so it wasn't obvious. This was a low traffic road, so it would look kind of suspicious. He pulled up a few hundred feet down the road, and we got out and cut through the woods so any passing traffic wouldn't see us entering the cemetery. Hopping the fence in the woods was easy. It was maybe a 3 or 4 foot fence. Chris led the way since it was mainly his idea. He led us through the eerie little plot of land, and we looked at the old tombstones. They all seemed to be from the 19th century. The writing on some of them was illegible. I know it sounds dumb and cliche, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I started looking around the surrounding woods. I told Chris how creepy it was, and he agreed. Still with the feeling of being watched, I looked at the abandoned building next to the cemetery. At one of the windows, I saw someone standing there, even through the fog, smudge, and dirt on the glass. But they quickly either ducked or walked away from the window. I told Chris we were being watched by someone in that building, and he turned to look at it as well. Then he went to look for the entrance to it. I told him not to, and that we should just leave before we got into trouble. I stayed by the tombstone while he walked around the building. Then I heard a loud crack. I looked in that direction and saw an older man, probably around 55, with gray hair, a black raincoat, jeans, and a mustache. The man opened his mouth and screamed, not just yelled, but screamed, "Get out!" It was so loud I thought I saw birds fly away. Suddenly, I started to feel lightheaded and everything went dark. The next thing I remember was waking up to being dragged in the woods. I freaked out, thinking I was being kidnapped, but when I turned and got up, I saw it was just Chris. He was freaking out and told me to follow him and run back to the car, so I didn't ask questions. As we ran through the woods, I heard something close behind me. When I turned, I realized we were being followed by someone, so I ran even faster. We got to his Honda, and he basically put it in drive before the car even had a chance to fully start. When Chris was inside that abandoned building, he found a sigil of Baphomet painted on the wood floor, which is basically the sign of Satan. Around it were a bunch of creepy dolls with buttons for eyes. He didn't see anything else in the building because he heard the old man scream at me outside. Chris came running to find me, passed out on the ground, and saw the old man slowly walking over to me. He started to drag me away from the old man and into the woods. He actually picked me up and threw me over the fence to get me out. I quickly came back to consciousness, and that's when we ran. I had only fainted once in my life, and it was at that moment. I don't know why I fainted, but it happening at a graveyard with some kind of satanic ritual building next to it makes it that much stranger. My grandpa passed away a few years ago. I was always very close to him. This past July, on his birthday, I visited his grave at the cemetery. The cemetery where he and my grandma chose to be buried was about an hour's drive from my apartment. My family lived closer, so they all went to his grave together, but I had to go separately. It was a rainy, depressing day, and there's nothing worse than visiting a cemetery on a gloomy day. The gatekeeper asked for the plot number. I gave it to him, and he let me in. It's a pretty big cemetery, and I'd only been there a couple of times before, not as the driver, so I had a hard time finding the plot. I didn't see many other people at the cemetery that day. I'm sure the weather had something to do with it. Eventually, I found a stone and parked my car on the grass to the side. I put some flowers down, stood there for a while with my eyes closed, and prayed. When I finished my prayer, I opened my eyes and looked up. There was an old man standing about 5 rows of graves down, directly across from me, looking right at me. I knew this man. It was my grandfather. No, it couldn't be. I rubbed my eyes, and he was gone. Did I just have a spiritual moment, or were my eyes playing tricks on me? Either way, I got chills and goosebumps. I was honestly freaked out. I got back in my car, said, "Love you, Grandpa," and drove off. I felt like I had a headache on my way home, not sure why. I was the only car on Prospect Road, a quiet road with dense forest on either side. Commonly, there would be deer crossing here. As my car zipped down the road, I spotted someone on the side of the road. There were no sidewalks or a walking path on this road, so I slowed down. It looked like my grandpa again. When I realized this, my heart dropped, and I swerved the car accidentally. I desperately tried to regain control and come to a stop. Luckily, my car didn't end up in a tree, but skidded out in the middle of the road until coming to a halt. I immediately looked back to where I saw him and saw a deer on the side of the road looking at my car. My heart was racing. I was terrified and needed to get home. I made sure no cars were coming and got back in my lane. I focused on the road as best I could, given what I had just seen twice. I felt weird the rest of the day. Not sick, but something wasn't right with my head. I went to bed early after watching an episode of my show. I woke up at 2 a.m. to my phone ringing. It was an unknown number. My heart started racing again. A call at this hour couldn't be good news. I accepted the call and put the phone to my ear. There was static on the other end. Finally, I said, "Hello?" More static. But then I thought I heard my grandpa's voice over the static, just briefly for maybe half a second. I tried to say hello again, but I was too shaken. Every part of my body was actually trembling. Then the call cut to silence and ended. I called my phone provider the next day to trace the number. They couldn't. They didn't have enough data to trace it. The events that took place that day and night were the scariest I've ever experienced. Do I think my dead grandpa was trying to contact me? I don't know, because that sounds ridiculous. You'd think if you experienced something like this, you'd be full of emotion and joy. But no, it still terrifies me. I really don't know what to think or how to feel about it. Whether it sounds ridiculous or not, this happened, and I wonder almost every other night, was that really my grandpa on the phone? My friends and I were very foolish when we were teenagers. I was about 17 or 18 when this happened. It was October, and I wanted to do something scary for Halloween. There's a small cemetery about 10 minutes from where I live, and when I was drunk with a couple of friends, I suggested we sneak into it. I'll make up some names for my friends, Jake and Sam. We were at Jake's house. He didn't drink ever, so when I came up with the idea, he was the one to drive us to the cemetery. Sam and I were really the ones leading this, and Jake was just along for the ride since he hadn't been drinking. Jake parked in a parking lot across the street. It was a ghost town because it was past midnight by then. We made sure no one was around to see us as we hopped the fence into the cemetery. It wasn't completely dark out, but it was hard to see more than 10 feet in front of us, so we used our phone flashlights. There didn't seem to be any night security in the cemetery, so we split up. Jake seemed to be following Sam more closely. I could still see their flashlights. I went off a little further on my own and decided to start taking a creepy video. I began recording with the light still on, of course. I recorded a bunch of old headstones and the general eerie vibe of the cemetery at night. I didn't see Sam and Jake anymore, so I started looking for them while still recording. I looked at my phone screen and froze. There was a woman dressed in a white gown or dress with long gray hair. She was looking down at the ground. I looked up from my phone screen to see her in person, but she was gone. I started to back away. I looked back at my phone screen, and there she was again, only now she was looking into the camera, or rather, at me. I looked up from the phone again and couldn't see her. I looked back at the screen and saw her moving closer to me. I started to scream for Sam and Jake as I sprinted away. I couldn't see their lights anywhere, and they weren't answering my screams. I had a feeling they were trying to scare me, so I ran back to the fence of the cemetery to hop it and get out. I made it to Jake's car and texted them, saying they needed to get out of the cemetery now. They met me at the car minutes later. We all sat in the car, and I showed them the video I took. They had the same horrified looks on their faces. Watching the video, I could see the moment the woman slowly lifted her head from looking at the ground to looking at me, and then she started moving towards me. We could see her moving for just a second or two before I started screaming and running away. But the way she moved, it seemed as though she were floating toward me. I have that video saved on my old iPhone 4S, but the phone won't turn on. It gets stuck at the Apple logo. I don't want to reset it until I can get that video off somehow. My friends firmly believe the woman in the video was a real person who also happened to be in the cemetery that night. But me, having been the one to actually see her, and only being able to see her on my phone screen, let's just say I was never a believer in the paranormal until that night.